join us today. We're here to talk about your new book, The Big Walk, and it's not just a book about a walk around the coast of England. It's also really a journey, isn't it, about yourself?
Yeah, it's a reflection, Dave, of my past, and the strange thing is this never ever came into my thinking for the last 60 years, I suppose, because I've been busy bringing up a family in New Zealand. I was in the army, had my own business, and so I don't think not many people reflect on their childhood. This happened quite strangely because I was walking long distances, as people would gather when you're walking around England, 16.5 miles a day on average. So you're walking 6 to 7 hours a day, and what do? You can listen to music with your earphones, or you can just walk and you've got to watch what you're going on, but a lot of the time you're thinking, and thoughts come into your mind, and then memories start to come back, and you start to recollect on different things, on your childhood. And it's just amazing when you start thinking like this how these little events come back. And it just gave me the chance to, to reflect on things, recollections of different things in the past. I contracted prostate cancer, and that was really the start of it, because when one gets any sort of cancer, of course, it's a momentous occasion for anybody, and it took 2 years for the treatment, and then my oncologist said he didn't want to see me again. And of course this was great news, and I walked on air as I walked out of his consulting rooms, and it was probably about 3 weeks after that I decided to do something for being cured of the disease, I suppose, if you can actually be cured. I don't think you're ever cured. I think you go into remission. But there was something that struck a chord with me when the oncologist said to me, we were glad that we caught this at its early stage. And I remember him saying, if we could only get a lot of men at this, in the early stages of prostate cancer. Now, I'm only talking about prostate cancer here. If they can get men at these early stages, he said, but the trouble is with a lot of men, they don't do anything about it until it's too late. And this struck a chord with me, and so this was about 3 or 4 weeks after my last consultation. I thought, why don't I do something about raising awareness to the benefits of early diagnosis for prostate cancer? And so I thought that was a good thing. And then I started to think about walking, because I'm relatively fit. And then I went over to Australia to do some training, road work and gym work in Australia, to get my strength up and stamina. And as my daughter said, Dad, if you're going to raise awareness for early diagnosis, why don't you raise funds as well at the same time? So this is how I happened to walk for charity for the Australian Cancer Research Foundation, but primarily for the Cancer Research UK. I was already starting to think about things about my childhood for some reason or other, and these thoughts, these reflections of the past came about my father, who I never knew, who died in France about a month before the Dunkirk evacuation, and the problems my mother had, evacuation, and impoverished times, and all these come up in the book about these sort of things, rationing, the war years, the post-war years. All these things start to come into my thinking, and the more you think about these things, more things arise. I always felt guilty about leaving my mother, because I left her when I was 15. I was in the Merchant Navy when I was 16, and then I immigrated to New Zealand when I was 17, and she never ever had the chance to really get close to me and to make up for having to evacuate me in those war years. I think she felt it more than I did, because kids can adapt very easily to their situation. but I think my mother always felt guilty about having to evacuate all the children. But when we arrived back from evacuation, my mother was you couldn't have got a better mother, and I mentioned this in the book. She was so loving, and we just couldn't. And all the siblings, when we get together, the 7 of us, we realised that we had such an incredible upbringing from a very in impoverished surroundings. You know, our house was just no electricity, no running hot water, just gas mantles in the lounge and gas mantle over the scullery, candles upstairs, and it must have been a nightmare for our mother. You know, she was on her own, bringing up the seven children, and so I think I felt guilty because when I left to go to New Zealand, when I immigrated to New Zealand at 17, even then I had this feeling that I should have stayed around my mother a lot longer, and I think I held that guilt all the time I was away. Our father, who we didn't know, he was killed in France at the early stage of the war. She got notice of his death through the War Office, and then 2 days later she gets a letter from our father that had been written from France. So she got this letter 2 days after she'd received notification of his death. So that must have been a very poignant moment for her, and she used to explain this many times to us when we were just teenagers back home. And she'd reflect on many things about how hard life was in those days for her. And the book, of course, is really mainly about my mother because of the devastating life she had during that period. And so my older sister told me there was a time when my mother didn't know where any of us were for about 6 months. No phone in the house, no mobile phones, of course. No phone where she was evacuated to, and because of the major demographic movement going on, the kids being moved around all over the place, families, because of the mass evacuation going on, she didn't know where we'd been sent to. And it took a few months to find out that we were in Norfolk, in a Dr. Bernarda's home in Norfolk, and my sisters were elsewhere, and she hadn't been notified where they'd been sent to. It just makes you realise what a wonderful country this is. Just a wonderful island. Of course, I've been away from this country for 41 years. I had no idea that there was such a just absolutely beautiful parts. And the thing is, most of my walking was done through bridle paths, public footpaths, coastal paths, places where people never went to anymore. And yet, once upon a time, before the roads were built, before the advent of the motor car, these bridle paths, these footpaths, these coastal paths were the highways and byways of England. You'd be walking along these paths, and you'd meet bullock-drawn carts, people going along, musicians going from one village to another, Shakespearean actors going around. These places would have these tracks would have been busy, but now busy lives have forgotten them. I don't suppose I thought about writing the book. I think what it was is I thought about writing some chronicle, some recording for my children, for my grandchildren and their children, so they could look back on something that their great-grandfather or their great-grandfather or their great-great-grandfather done, and see how his life was as a child, and his brothers and sisters and his mother, and things that happened during the war years. And so I don't know anything about my great-grandfather or my grandfather, and yet I'd love to know how his life was as a child. But of course I haven't got that information. No one has. But now my grandchildren have got a chance of knowing what I was up to when I was a kid, and what I looked like when I was a 15-year-old, what I was doing when I was a 13-year-old, you know. And I don't reflect much on my feelings too much in the book, as far as how I was feeling at the time. Sometimes I felt devastated at the end of the day. Sometimes I wanted to pack up the whole thing. Sometimes I'd say to myself, what am I doing this for? And it was only when I started to get donations coming in for the walk from people that used to lift my spirits up. But you just can't begin, you can't start putting things in about how you're feeling, because people don't want to think about or read about your negative thoughts. So I try to keep it as light as possible during the walk. I think this euphoria came on to me all of a sudden, and then of course the last day of the walk I'd planned a marathon walk. It was flat terrain, easy to walk. I knew once I'd done it that last day I wouldn't have to get up in the morning to do another walk, so it was logical to make that last day the big walk. So and I had Emmy who came with me, a friend of mine, who came with me on their last walk, where we did 26 and a half miles walk from Middleton on sea through to Brighton Marina. Then we had everybody meet us at Worthing, all the supporters meet us at Worthing Pier, and that was incredible to have everybody there on a double-decker bus supplied by the Brighton and Hove bus company. And then we all made our way back from Worthing, made our way back to Brighton Pier, where I was interviewed by the press and TV, and then after that we made our way back to the Brighton Marina, where a big reception was waiting for me, and that was it. The book itself has become a delightful chronicle for my children and for my grandchildren and for friends, and maybe it's going to have appeal for the greater public, who knows? We'll wait and see.
David Wilson, thank you very much.
Thank you.